And we end up with Cambridge P with Michael and Thomas. Who's speaking first?
Michael P. And A. Thomas Hay.
Okie dokie. So it looks like we're done. My name is Michael. Call me whatever you want. This has to ban international aid charities from using sensational, graphic, or overly emotional images of suffering in fundraising and advertising campaigns.
Whoa, there's someone knocking. Oh.
It's the ghost of dead debates.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin with the mechanism and then move on to the two major areas I want to discuss. Namely, what is the state interest in terms of the regulation of the advertising of the charity industry? And secondly, I want to look at why this is the least intrusive method of implementing such regulation and why we think we're getting clear benefits with it. I want to begin here with the mechanism. We think that we already regulate significant amounts of advertising in the private sector. So we think that we can simply initially extend the purview of those bodies over towards the charity sector. In terms of definition of misleading, we somehow managed to separate misleading advertising from biased advertising or outright lies in the status quo in the private sector. We think we can apply the same standard here, where if the intent is to mislead, or try and manipulate people, or give a misleading impression, we will prohibit it. We might not catch everything, we think it's sufficient. Any questions on that?
In many countries, that's the status quo. Charities aren't exempt from the status quo. In countries like Australia, the UK,
that's great. We think that we're perfectly happy to regulate their sales, and if their status quo is that they're not allowed to use overly emotional advertising in order to try and manipulate people, we're going to agree with the Australians. Okay, what is the state interest here? We think we have a couple interests. We think the general reason here is to protect the free choice of its citizens. We think that the state has a vested interest in ensuring that citizens are able to make informed decisions, whether politically or even in their private lives. This is, for instance, why the state regulates scams in order to try and prevent them from being ripped off. It's also why the state regulates private sector advertising so the citizens don't lose money on it. We think in a lot of ways, the same thing applies to charities. If you are giving money to a charity you wouldn't otherwise have done to because their intention was to mislead you, we think that is denying citizens their free choice. And we think the purpose of an overly emotional appeal is to impair their ability to make logical decisions and thereby dent their free choice. And we think that therefore we can extend this principle to it. We think we also see this in terms of things like libel, which we prohibit. We think, therefore, that any situation that tries to limit people's decision-making requires state intervention. So let's look at some of the cases in which we do it. We think we do this where we see market failures, because we think the major ingredient of making choices is information, which is one reason why we prevent companies from doing it. But we think, if anything, the reasons for doing it here in the charity sector are much greater. Because in the private sector, if a company engages in false advertising, they will most likely have competitors who will respond to that false advertising, and you will have a clash of views. No such equivalent exists in the charity sector. The Relief for War Orphans in Rwanda is not going to run attack ads on save people from the hurricanes in Burma. And because of that, this tends to exist in an echo chamber where both the public has little background knowledge of many of the things these charities deal with, and there's no competing message, meaning that the only message you receive about these places or situations is the one that's in the ad. I suspect I could create a fictional country, tag on some sad music, get some pictures from Google imagery, and run an ad about all of the poor orphans who are suffering in the northeastern African Republic, and somehow raise a lot of money from people from it. And we think it's precisely that, and the deference that's given in this field, that goes under it. But we think this is important, because what's good, that's the short run harm. What's the long run harm? The long-run harm, we think, is that people will end up internalizing this. We think what we see with attack ads in the United States is people more or less roll their eyes at them and assume that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, encouraging people to do ever more extreme ones. We think that if people get used to being emotionally manipulated by these appeals, they say, oh God, not another one of those orphan appeals with sad music. And we think that prevents people from giving money to actual ones and tends to close them off for audiences. So we think it both burns them in the short run and also burns them in the longer run, leading them to think that charities are like everything else and are also desensitizing them to suffering. Sure.
Do you think it's wrong for Ford to claim
I think that it's illegitimate for them to claim their cars are made in the United States if that's not true. I think it would also fairly be illegitimate if they attempted to say made in America while the photo they showed was not of a Ford car, or the photo they showed was not actually of a car made in America. And I think that people do step in to regulate that. We have no objection to charities doing this. We have charities attempting to manipulate with it. Okay, why do we think this is not intrusive? First, because we think that first of all, we haven't killed the private sector by engaging in a degree of regulation of their advertising. And evidently, this has not killed charities in Australia. So we think that's it. But we think that what it will do is it'll incentivize them to go for more direct appeals. That means going up to people and trying to explain this. It means going for more informational methods, whether they be interviews or efforts to educate people about the conflict, or simply to put more facts and numbers in. While this might be superficially less effective in the short run, we think in the long run it has the potential to be more effective, and also it has the potential in the long run to actually increase political awareness and determination to intervene. Because if you do a good job on selling people on your cause, you'll have more likelihood of an intervention. Some poor causes might not do as well, but we think in that case the market of the charities works that well. We think that this is an important thing to point out, because we think that the alternative, which is unregulating charities, allowing people to put up what they want, poses a danger to the public, poses a danger to the charity sector, and ultimately leads to less money going to charities. It leads the people to making decisions to pay into the wrong charities, and it ends up leading to everyone being burnt on the entire field. And for these reasons, I proudly propose.
I thank the gentleman very much for his, thank you very much for your speech. Please, next speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear. We're not going to defend charities intentionally telling lies and saying that they have operations in Cambodia when they only operate in Africa. We're not going to defend that, because what these sort of governments strangely set up is basically a case which sort of sets out the impossible. They take the lowest bar possible. Let's talk about where this debate actually lies, ladies and gentlemen. It's in those borderline cases where charities claim that you will save lives, where they claim that you will make a difference. But the effect of your donations is often ambiguous, and it's ambiguous for a number of reasons. One, some programs will be effective, some programs won't ultimately be effective. Two, it's not obvious because of where your funds will go. Some of the funds that a charity receives will go to its administration, some to its fundraising, some to its programs, and so on. And so there is an argument that directly saying that you save lives could potentially be considered misleading, but isn't a blatant lie. It's those borderline cases where this debate takes place, that's what we're going to defend on the opposition. We're also happy to defend charities being given slightly more leeway in terms of the graphic material that they show, and we're happy for charities to show more explicit death and suffering than would be allowed by other organisations within society. So that's where this debate lies today, ladies and gentlemen. Because what we heard from the opening government is this idea that it sort of desensitizes people. Well, we say no more to the extent where you ban all advertising altogether, because you don't have that emotional connection in the first place. But what I'm going to tell you is 4 key things in my speech. 1, why an emotional connection created in this way is legitimate and necessary. 2, why it leads to more meaningful engagement in causes that matter. Thirdly, why it's better for the charitable and social sector at large. And fourthly, why the regulation that they're proposing is hugely problematic in terms of implementation. We're talking about things, ladies and gentlemen, like the big movement that happened 2 years ago where a person dies every 3 seconds and you had celebrities around the world clapping on TV. We're talking about things like the Global Poverty Project, where it says that for the same price as a shoe, you could save this many lives because a bed net, for example, costs $5. And on average, a bed net helps this many people or costs this much money. It's those emotional connections which are playing on people's emotions and their guilt and their sort of wealth and well-being that we're really talking about here. And what problem this addresses is that at the moment people in a large chunk of the world simply cannot relate to the real human suffering that occurs elsewhere in the world. So when you go to like Kenyan slums and see people drinking sewage water, when you go to parts of West Africa where sort of female genital mutilation still takes place, when you go to parts of India where children have no access to education, live off the street, can't communicate, can't speak, and are disabled, and like have a life of begging with like missing limbs, it's that kind of connection that people who never go to these countries simply cannot relate to in a meaningful way, even if they might have seen like the odd image on a movie or this and that. And so what we say is that it's very easy for people to dismiss images where you don't play to their emotional connection. That's what we're trying to avoid by creating a greater understanding in this instance. We're also happy on the opposition side to support greater investment in things like existing sites like the Global Giving Index and Philanthropy Measure, sites which actually enable people to easily and accurately, on an objective basis, compare charities. And what we're proposing is using that emotional connection that is born through advertising, through graphic material, to then engage and direct people in more meaningful ways in terms of assessing which of these programs are most effective. And we say that it's that first emotional connection that is often in many ways necessary to cause people to engage in a deeper measure. And we're happy to concede on opening up that some charities are going to be more effective than others. We just think the way that you get most people in the population thinking about these issues is on our side of the house. First point I'm going to bring you in substantive. I didn't start my timer, so I'm a bit lost, but that's fine. Why emotional connection is legitimate and necessary. What we say, as I've already told you, is that these things in many parts of the world are very real. Like, human suffering is legitimate. You have 3 billion people without access to proper sanitation. You have 1.2 billion people without access to basic water. You have 1.8 billion people without any healthcare whatsoever. And we say that it's that human suffering that is very real, that is facing a huge section of the world's population, and we're more than happy to put that in people's faces and make them aware of what is actually happening. We also think that it puts people in a legitimate moral dilemma. The reality is that, on average, you spending money in superficial ways like clothing you do have a choice to use that money in other ways. That is a real choice that you have. And sure, some programs will be effective, some programs won't. But we think that by putting people in that moral dilemma, it enables them to think about it and engage in that. And even if you disagree with their decision, it at least makes them force about it. Why it leads to more meaningful engagement. We say that firstly, often people are able to dismiss these causes because it doesn't affect them in their everyday lives. And by putting it in their face, it forces them to have a deeper understanding and a deeper connection with that. At the moment, often people only see what is around them, and whilst as debaters we might be slightly more well-travelled than most, we're certainly not representative of the vast majority of the population, when more than half of Americans don't have passports and never leave the country. What we say is this actually forces people to consider different causes to what they other would, to engage in a different level than the intellectual level or other levels that you're proposing. Why is this better for charities? A few reasons. Firstly, what's the alternative in this instance? Because at the moment, charities rely on this graphic advertising, they rely on the emotional engagement. And so what you're going to have is either a huge number of charities put out of business that rely on it, or the alternative is that they try to raise the same money in more expensive, less effective ways. So they spend more on admin, more on fundraising, and less actually on programs. We're happy to stand for charities raising money in an effective way so that they can actually focus on improving the effectiveness of the programs and improving the way that these organizations work. I'll take closing.
Okay, am I more or less likely to relate to someone when I see an image that portrays their life experiences vastly different to mine?
We think that it's not mutually exclusive for starters. We think that local charities can engage in a way that you might relate to, as well as people overseas. But the point is not necessarily to engage in a way that you can relate to, it's in a way that you can't relate to. That is I have no concept of not having sanitation. I've never thought of that before because I've never been in that position. The closer you are to someone, the less you're able to see them as in a unique position for you and in need of help to a greater extent. And so we're happy to stand by that. So we think that it's better for charities because the alternative is less focused on programs, more on admin and fundraising. We also think that there's not a crowding out effect under this model because there's a natural mechanism to correct for it. That is, if it's ineffective to put up another graphic advertising, then charities are less likely to do it and they'll look to engage in other ways. We're fine with that. Lastly, very quickly on regulation. We think that it's hugely important that we deal with regulation in an objective fashion, and we don't think you can under this model because the very nature of causes is that different people will relate to causes in different ways and care differently about different issues. And as soon as you impose that regulation, you're imposing value judgments on what causes matter, what causes don't matter, and how those things will actually relate to people on an emotional level. The only way to be objective is to allow this. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're talking about in this case is the borderline cases where it is ambiguous about whether or not a charity is or isn't telling the truth and about the effect of your contribution. We say for the charitable sector, for the sake of the individual, for the sake of solving these problems and putting people in a situation that enables them to relate to it, very proud to oppose. Thanks.
After you are thanked, then bravo, you are qualified.
Mr. Speaker, in this speech, the two new things I'm going to add are firstly about exploitation. Why are you exploiting the victims portrayed in these ads, via these ads, and secondly, the potential donors who you're advertising to, but also secondly, how you're creating a race to the bottom via these ads, and we think it's important to stop that. Before that, quite a lot of rebuttal. Some of this will actually also count as substantive, but for convenience, let's call it our rebuttal. Right? So the first thing here is that we think that Nat makes a problematic characterization of the kind of ads we're going to ban in this debate, right? Because we think that Dan was particularly clear when he talks about the kind of ads we're going to ban in this debate are those that portray, for example, emaciated children who are literally skin and bones, Mr. Speaker, or people who are lacking legs because they stepped on unexploded mines, say, in North Korea. Or example of someone who has had acid poured on their face, say, for example, in Pakistan or in the Middle East, Mr. Speaker, member of this House. These are all people who are, while they might be somewhat representative of the causes that they are used to champion, they are used to champion, right? Typically what happens is that these are also the worst possible cases in order to actually elicit the emotional responses that Dan talks about as particularly exploitative of these consumers, Mr. Speaker, right? And that's probably why in a lot of places it's already status quo, because a lot of places recognize that it is in fact exploitative, Mr. Speaker. We're happy to extend that this policy to other places, right? The second thing here is that actually he claims that this leads to better and more engagement with these charities, right? And I'm going to contend, Mr. Speaker, that that is false. Because the kind of engagement you're going to foster with these kinds of ads is a sort of emotional, non-rational engagement, Mr. Speaker, right? And that emotional, non-rational engagement is really what's dangerous. Because Nat is correct when he says that we really want rational engagement. But that's not what he gets here, for two reasons. First of all, when you have these ads that are explicitly designed to exploit people's emotions, what's likely to happen to the way in which people respond is they're likely to switch off the rational parts of their brain that used to evaluate what it is they're going to do next, right? Intuitively, when you appeal to people's emotions, people are far less likely to be able to rationally consider these things, right? But secondly, we think that these images are typically deeply, deeply unpleasant. It's not pleasing to look at people who've had their face burned off because they were acid was poured in their face because they refused to enter into arranged marriage, right? So, how people are likely to respond, right, when they're faced with these images is they do the thing that makes these images go away as quickly as possible to assuage their guilt, which means that they're actually more likely to disengage as soon as they possibly can. And this is incredibly damaging, right? Because the biggest problem with charity today, Mr. Speaker, isn't quite the lack of money. While it would be useful for there to be more money in charity today, the biggest problem is how effectively that money is spent. And the point at which, Mr. Speaker, that the kind of donors you have are people who just give their money and try to run away as quickly as possible because these images you're showing them are deeply unpleasant, you're not able to have that rational consideration of where this money is spent and these charities held to account. At the point at which you rationally persuade these donors in order to engage with your charity, that's when you're most likely to have these donors properly engage with your charity in a way that makes sure that these charities are properly run and their money is effectively spent, right? Because lots of these charities actually misappropriate their money. They spend it on cushy trips for their executives or cushy offices for their executives, and that's terrible, right? And we think that the reason why we are unable to stop that is because of these overly emotional appeals, Mr. Speaker, right? So when Nat says that they actually get more money as a consequence out of this, we say, firstly, Dan responds to this in many ways. I'm going to point out how Dan responds to that. But secondly, even if we do get less money on our side, we have more effective money, and that is better, right? Why don't we get less money on our side? Dan explains this in several ways. First, we think that these consumers don't like to get burned, right? They will feel burned as a consequence of these overly emotional appeals. Second, you desensitize them in the long run. The more you see of these overly emotional images, the more likely you're not going to feel swayed by the existence of these images, and we think that in the long run, you're probably far less likely to get engaged. Thirdly, right, the fact that you're essentially creating a race to the bottom, right, with regard to the worst images possible in order to maximize your donations, suggests that what's likely to happen is that you're creating the impression that you're creating this race to bottom, which probably will leave a bad taste in donors' mouths, so they're probably not going to donate more. But finally, we think that rational persuasion can be as effective if properly deployed, Mr. Speaker. Fine.
If your argument holds, why did the Global Poverty Project's initiative showing graphic images of acid attacks on women in Pakistan raise 3.5 million pounds in 1 month?
This means it, right? So, firstly, right, we don't know what the counterfactual is. We think it's entirely plausible, in fact, likely, that if we use rational persuasion instead, we can raise the same amount of money, right? But secondly, we think that that's exactly the kind of response we don't want, which is that people throw their money and run away as quickly as possible because the images we're showing them are so deeply unpleasant, right? Exploitation, Mr. Speaker, right? You're exploiting the viewers of these ads and their emotions, right? Because you're seeking to override the rational part of people's brains that might lead them to say no, right? That's not meaningful consent to donation, right? And while it might be a form of consent, that's not the version of consent that we should aspire to, Mr. Speaker. Because just intuitively, the best form of consent is rationally considered consent, right? And it's rationally considered consent that people are least likely to regret, and therefore the most solid version of consent, right? So we think that the existence of these overly emotional images are exploitative, which is one, inherently wrong because you're overriding the rational part of people's brains, but also it's harmful to consumers. They feel exploited, they're less likely to donate in the future, that's harmful, right? It also exploits the subjects of these ads, right? Their circumstances are turned into a spectacle for the public in these rich countries to see, right? While we might use it to try to get people to donate, you don't really get more donations as a consequence. That's really harmful. That's really disrespectful to these people when you reduce them to an image or a tool for the fundraising of these charities. And finally, races to the bottom, short but important, right? Because we think that some of these people can be helped, right? Particularly the subjects of these ads, right? A photographer could easily have made sure that the person in their ad wouldn't die, all right, by trying to make sure that they got proper food or what have you, right, in the case of emaciated, starving kids. In the status quo, that doesn't happen because the photographer means that they have to give up their ad as a consequence. That's really dangerous. We are proud to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why charities use emotive images is because they work as a way of raising funds. And given we believe in saving lives, we believe that raising more funds for charities which save lives is a good thing. And for this reason, we think that this motion has to fall. What am I going to talk to you about today, ladies and gentlemen? First, I'm going to talk about how we improve the allocation of funds within the charity sector by allowing charities to show emotive images. Second, I'm going to explain why this is not a form of manipulation and how, in fact, emotions are a legitimate and important part of any form of decision-making. But before I get onto those two main points, I'm going to look at 4 points of rebuttal. 4? Yes, 4. First, we heard this idea that charities choose the worst possible cases to get charitable donations, and this is, exploitative. Now, we're okay with them using the worst possible cases because these cases actually happen. As we said, we're not defending lying. So long as these cases happen, we're fine with them choosing the worst ones. Those are the people who need the most money. So there's no problem with using those images to try and raise funds in order to help those who are worst off. We don't think that point stands. Second, we got this idea that people disengage when they see emotive images. Well, empirically, that's just not true. That's why charities do it. It's why charities have tried lots of different forms of fundraising over the years and have kind of settled on this motive. And don't just trust me. The Global Poverty Project, as my partner mentioned, raised, they're worried about a control test here. They raised 2.5 billion more than they had done per month before they introduced the new emotive images project of showing women in Pakistan with acid attacks. Similarly, the UN have tried lots of different forms of advertising throughout different countries, and again have settled on this one idea. No, thank you. So we got this idea that it's better if you just have a rational advert. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like. Maybe an image on the screen with a premise by premise argument of why you ought to give money. But the point is here that most people don't respond to just rational images. They instead see, the vast majority of people who aren't debaters see the image, and that's what gets their attention. So we don't think that these rational adverts will work better because people just won't notice them. Thirdly, no thank you, we heard this idea that charities waste money on cushy trips, and this is really bad. Yeah, we agree that's really bad. It's not obvious that there's any difference on our side of the house as compared to their side of the house. But at least we're willing to uphold the current rules that would remove charitable status if charities waste too much money on these cushy trips abroad. We don't see that helps either side's case particularly. And fourth, we got this idea that we exploit people at the bottom by I'll take you in a moment, by taking photos of them. Well, we can ask for their consent before we take their photos. We think that might remove much of the problem, but also, ultimately, these photos are going to be helping them, because these photos are trying to show information about their plight to other people and then get money raised in order to help those people out. So even if the consent doesn't completely get around the exploitation problem, we think it's outweighed by the fact it actually makes their lives better off. Yes?
What type of donors are better? Those who are consistently engaged with your charity, or those who donate money and try to get as far away as possible?
So we don't think that you have to have one or the other. We assume the more cerebral donors who continue going are going to presumably still donate on both sides of the house. It is even possible if we want to have rational adverts in addition to emotional adverts, if we're really worried that the rational section of the population will switch off. That's fine. You guys are just shutting out the people who will donate via pictures. We want to include them as well as the rational people. So now moving on to my first point, the idea that it will improve the allocation of funds. The first half of this, it will increase the allocation of funds to charities. Why is that? One, because people will take more notice. People take notice when you have an image of someone with horrific scar burns, of a child who has no legs. When you're flicking through the TV, you see that image and then you take notice. We agree that might not on its own lead to a long-term commitment to that charity, but it means that you start talking about it. It means you start getting involved. Also, secondly, not only does it make them notice more, it means they are more motivated when they notice it. Because the important part about the emotional part of your cognitive faculties is that is the thing that drives motivation, that drives action. So not only do people notice these adverts more, they are far more likely to act on those feelings and give money to those charities. Yes?
If I as a charity have to compete on the basis of visceral suffering, is there any incentive for me to stay around after that particular crisis is cleared up?
Sorry, can you say that point again?
If I as a charity have to compete on the basis of visceral suffering, is there any reason for me to stay in that place once that immediate...
Well, so presumably, in fact, charities we think are motivated to help people. So they're going to go wherever people need most help. If it means that on the calculus of where do they help more people, they go to places where there's more suffering, we're fine with that because we think those people who are suffering more are people who are more deserving of money. So if charities relocate there because they get more donations for that, we think that's probably quite a good thing. So first, that's how it increases the allocation of funds to charities as a whole. But second, we think that it will improve the allocation. Why is that? One, because if you notice the advert, you start discussing it more. And if you start discussing the charity behind it, it means you get much more like critical engagement with how charities operate, how they work, which ones are better and which ones are worse. An example of this is the Jewish Chronicle in the UK outraged, no thank you, over a Gaza advert showing like images of children in Gaza. They disagree with this. This led to the emotive images. This led to a wider discussion that revealed that one of the charities the UN was giving money to had in fact been funding Hamas. And for that reason, that charity was then dropped off of the UNESCO list of approved charities. So we think that this emotional response starts a discussion which we think is good for all of the rational reasons that these guys gave. But finally, why is this not manipulation? We'll go into a bit more depth of to how it is that people actually make decisions. No, thank you. So we choose, how do we make free decisions? Well, we choose first our goals by reflecting on them, and second, we work out how to achieve these goals in a kind of means-ends way. So we think about the consequences of our actions, whether they'll achieve those goals. So what is manipulation? It's when it interferes with one of those two things. Most scams involve that second one, in lying to people about how to achieve their goals. I'm a Nigerian general, give me your bank details, I'll give you lots of money, you have the goal of making money. We don't think that this is what's going on here particularly. These emotive ones aren't claiming they're going to be any better or any worse, they're just saying, look, here's a big problem. So does it come into this second category? Does it change their goals? Well, the way that you might change somebody's goal and then therefore manipulate them, or in the language of opening government, exploit them, is, well, the typical case is like brainwashing, maybe, with like religion in small children, or subliminal advertising. Is emotional responses this kind of thing? No, for two reasons. First, because we think that most people already have the goals of like saving lives. That's why probably they find the image upsetting. If they didn't care already about saving children, then they're not going to then they wouldn't have this emotive response that these guys are worried about. So all we're doing is not changing their goals, we're just reminding them that here is a thing which coheres with your goals. Maybe you should start getting involved in it. So this means they start giving more time, more money to those goals. So we don't think that it changes their motivation. And secondly, even those who don't already have those goals, we think that an emotional way of forming your goals is a completely legitimate way of doing it. I'm not even sure how else to form your goals other than emotions. The reason why I know pain is bad is not through rational reflection, because I have a feeling that it's really bad. The reason why I know death is bad is so I have an emotional response to seeing people dying. That is the way of forming your goals. Therefore, it doesn't interfere in any way in the means-ends analysis, and it's a fairly legitimate way of helping people motivate their end goals. And for that reason, it's not manipulation. And for this reason, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Tommy, is it not turning on the light before you sit down? Okay, that's much nicer. Thank you very much for your speech, and now Brian, please.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to explain two things in this extension. First of all, I'm going to talk about why the current charity sector that we have is not doing as well as it should do, and why this is a byproduct of many things, but including this form of advertising. And secondly, I'm going to explain to you why our current form of advertising feeds into false and self-sustaining perceptions of continents like Africa, which are extremely problematic in the long run. Like, before that, just to clarify some stuff that happens in the first half, right? First part, I want to talk about what is best for the donors, and first up, I want to talk about what's best for the people who receive this money. We're probably willing to go with this calculus, right, as being the more vulnerable group. We're going to tackle them on like the what reduces less suffering metric, and the what makes this aid more effectively spent metric, because we do like agree that should be a thing, right? We say that even if, like as Michael points out in the POI, even if it is a legitimate tool to use, we think it is a tool that is less effective. Therefore, we will remove it anyway, even if it is the thing that principally charities should be able to do. Right. So first of all, basically, like as Elo like admits in response to my POI, this is like the most visceral, and he says this again himself many times, that this is the most effective form of advertising, that everything else like is less effective, and that's what these charities would have to resort to if they didn't. Right? So that implies that the way for charities to compete with one another is on the basis of suffering, like Cleena points out in her POI, right? It means that charities move to the current disaster scenario and like take pictures of that thing. It means that they try to attack the most immediate forms of poverty, the most like starvation, breadline forms of poverty, and deal with those problems and say, look, we've fed people and we've given them water. But it means that other forms of causes that could be more effective in the long run get crowded out. Because notice, for example, that if I wanted to be a charity that focused on perhaps making education like allow women to enter in an African country, that would be a much less sexy cause, or like not sexy, that's the wrong adjective, but it would be a much less emotionally appealing cause than the emaciated children one, right? I could not compete with them on the visceral emotion of that energy because of the emotional reaction that these guys talk about, right? Because I wouldn't have the same thing. It means that charities currently focus more on band-aid solutions as opposed to like medicine, right? We think that charities, like the effect of charities and their real ability to affect change in the world is slightly about performance, like the first half talked about, but it's vastly more about the institutions that surround where that charity works. It is vastly like their ability to act is vastly more based on whether there is a working transport system there, whether the government is corrupt, whether that government has a working bureaucracy, etc., etc. It is attacking and fixing these structural problems that exist in many places. That means that charity will be able to do more than disaster relief in the future, so we get more long-term change, right? If aid never tackles these structures, then continually we just have to keep giving band-aid solutions, and charity never seems to do anything to really get these places out of poverty and really fix what's going on there. We are not sure if emotional exhaustion amongst donors happens, but it definitely happens in academic circles, right? There are currently academics who say that charity does not work, that charity cannot work, and you have the other side of the camp trying to argue why it does. What they really may be saying is that charity could work if it was different, but that's not like the soundbite that comes out. The soundbite is charity does or doesn't work, right? And that's extremely problematic because it lessens our traction and from the elite circles to keep doing anything about this. We think that not only is structural change better because it means that future aid will work better, not only is it better because it means that more people in the long run will have less suffering, but also because it is self-perpetuating, right? If you set up good structures in a country, it means that not only will aid continue to work, but eventually aid won't be necessary, right? Because you have tackled the understanding of the problem. Of course there will always be natural disasters and disease outbreaks and things like this, but you won't have constant cycles of poverty that are based on that basis. Go ahead.
We're quite happy to support structural improvements, which is why foundations and government agencies and so many organizations are dedicated to that. Can you deal with your assumption that all causes and all charities need to be dealt with?
Right, okay. So, first of all, right, we think that there is an untapped resource in terms of people who are donating to disaster relief and who are not donating to those causes at the moment. We think that it would be better if they could choose those things, but also we think that there is a unique benefit that happens when charities do this thing as opposed to governments or quasi-government sponsored organizations, which is that it is simply not cultural imperialism to the same extent. It is genuinely better for people on the ground to not see this as the UK or some nation like that telling me how to run my country, but charities, right? Even if they are dominated by white volunteers, even if they speak English and stuff like that, there is at least a degree of difference by which it is not seen as dictating and stuff like that. This seems like an extreme example, but the literal translation of Boko Haram is Western education is sin or something like that. There is a current feeling that we are telling them how to run their countries. When aid agencies and independent advisors who don't have a government tag tell you that you should be doing these things for your own benefit, it's easier for you to swallow, and that's better, right? We need to tackle the long-term narrative that aid doesn't work. We think this is better, but it's also better in terms of addressing structural biases and structural problems that result from these failing systems. Things like female education, right? That is not a thing that is ever going to be solved without tackling the structural problems in those countries and the institutional biases that exist there. Right, perceptions quickly. We think that when you only see starving Africans, you think that that is what that monolith of a continent that many people will call a country is, and only is. That is problematic in the terms of when a charity tries to do something different, right, and raise long-term stuff, they don't have, you don't see why these people would need laptops or mobiles because they're clearly starving, because that's what you know. But it also feeds into the way that we interact with people from those places in our everyday lives, because you see that they are from this place their abstract thought is less relatable because you don't see it as like a thing that can come from that place. Foreign direct investment goes to them less because it's not a place that is ever worthwhile in investing in, and stuff like that, because it's like you see it as a thing that like that entire continent is always going to be suffering, it always has been suffering, and it's simply money down the drain. This also like feeds into the rhetoric that charity simply doesn't work as a thing. We think that if we can get more charity that does more benefit over the long term and that can genuinely affect the future, but moreover stuff that tackles structural biases and means that one day charity will be less necessary in those places, except in the cases of disasters, we think we win on all of the metrics that have been put forward. We're very happy to propose.
Are we good?
Yes, 1 second, please.
No problem.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen, and Michael, take it away.
Opening government did a good job of setting up a debate that is a contrast between rational persuasion and the emotional. And that has consistently been the clash in today's debate. What opening opposition did is tell you why this is a persuasive form of persuasion, right? Why emotional persuasion convinces people to give. What we're going to tell you is why it is the only way to get people to give, given the informational and emotional landscape that most givers in the developed world find themselves in. I'm going to do that by exposing 3 distortions in that emotional and discursive space. First off, response to closing government. So what closing government did is they told us this incentivized people to give band-aid solutions, right? Just deal with the short term and not the long term. Response number 1, it's unclear why it's bad to relieve immediate suffering. 2 things to note here. 1, because it can be expressed so graphically, it's often very deep suffering, right? We do think there is a difference between the need for a laptop and the need for basic food or medical care when there's an epidemic. But secondly, and more importantly, we think it's just more cost effective, right? It's much cheaper to provide someone with food than it is with Toshibas, right? Second response, however, is that even if you don't buy this more utilitarianly effective, it's simply not clear why charities that want to focus on institution building can't also leverage images of starving people, right? Presumably institution building still makes that better. Interestingly, it's worse for those charities on your side, because a disaster relief charity, under their policy, I can still legitimately say, look at these fucking starving people, look how I'm helping them, right? Whereas on your side of the house, right, you can't do that as the institution building charity, because all of a sudden, under opening government's metric, that's not an accurate representation of what you're actually doing. So actually on our side, these institution building charities can still leverage that. Note the WHO, which builds healthcare infrastructure in these countries, does leverage these images, whereas on your side, they actually can't, because it's not an accurate representation of what they're actually doing under the ground, which is what Daniel in opening government was so concerned about. The third thing, however, to say, right, is it's just not, this whole charity doesn't work argument is contingent upon this being an ineffective mode of giving. 1, I think I've made that sufficiently implausible to you, and crucially, I don't need to prove to you that it's necessarily the most effective mode of giving. I simply have to prove to you that it's ambiguous, and because we get more giving on our side, as I'm going to prove to you later, we still win the debate, therefore, right? The fourth thing they say is this reduces FDI. Look, I just don't think investors at Goldman Sachs are realistically making their decisions based on charitable advertising. They tend to look at better indicators of what's actually going on the ground, like HDI, and like the businesses they could actually potentially invest in. So I think that's misdirected, and please don't challenge us on the business. So let's just briefly respond to opening government. So opening government first said this is irrational, right? Crucially, as opening opposition point out, moral decisions are always irrational, right? Whether I want to give someone proximate to me or someone far away, and whether or not I rate proximity as important or shared nationality as important, is entirely an emotional decision. There's no a priori rational basis for it either way. And therefore it makes sense to provide people with an emotional stimulus to make these sorts of decisions. The second thing that they tell us is, people become inured to these images over time. So I think the first thing says you actually misunderstand, right, how people give, right? Yes, like they see the ad and then they give the money, right? Next time they see the ad, they might not give the money. 1, that's true of all advertisement, right? When I see an ad in a particular mold, I don't, not as receptive at the first time. But secondly, they're already giving money. The notion of charitable giving is something that's important, is already implanted in their head. So it's not clear that the fact the next ad will be less effective has any impact, because they already believe that giving to charity is an important thing. It's crossing that initial emotional threshold that's the most important thing to do. But thirdly, this just gives charities an incentive to be clever, and they are clever, right? Look at WorldWell's ads that juxtapose
juxtapose like loads of bathwater in the Western world with like emaciated kids in Africa living in the desert, right? We think that actually you can just do that, you can just make these ads emotionally responsible, people emotionally respond to these ads just by being a bit more clever about how you do them and playing upon particular juxtapositions. But moreover, what we'd say is you can just exploit the scale of what's going on, right? Tsunami ads were still infected, despite the fact we'd all seen their content before, because it was just bigger, right? They made clear that the suffering was just bigger, so you can still do this just by being clever and exploiting different aspects of people's emotional response to these sorts of things. The final thing that Carlos says is, people don't pay attention to where the money's actually going. That's simply not a realistic interpretation of how people actually give and how they think when they give, right? I don't just give money, right, and then that's it, right? I watch the ad, and then I think, am I going to give money to this charity? Maybe there's some other charities I might consider, right? Consumers just aren't as dumb as you'd say, and the reason we know that is because they manage to use price comparison websites and just think about all the other purchases they make, and there's no reason why they should be different in this case. So, 3 distortions to people's emotional and informational landscape that occur. Number 1, a basic proximate bias, right? A desire to give to people nearer to me rather than people further away who may potentially be suffering more. And this is natural because people want to give based on a personal connection and perceive that to be morally important. In particular, 2 ways in which this arises. 2 ways in which this arises that mean that more money gets given to developed countries where typically it has less impact on really vulnerable people. 1, you're more likely to meet and interact with people who are relatively suffering, right, in wealthy countries, right? Just because you probably live in one if you're someone we care about in this debate in terms of actually giving money, right? The unemployed or the homeless in that developed country, who, in just basic terms have less material need than those in a developing one. But the second thing to point out here is you also like to appeal to nationalist sentiment, right? An American is suffering is much more persuasive to a large number of Americans than a human being in Africa is suffering. And these appeals to identities that have been formed from the day that people are born and strengthened through image and emotional sentiment from the day that they are born are often exploited by charities that focus on domestic countries or politicians who want to relieve domestic suffering. The key thing to note is this. This isn't a logical bias, right? It's built up over the course of the images, through interaction, through nationalism, through all these sentiments that build up over people's lives. And the only way you can counteract it is with an emotional response, with an equally persuasive image that corrects that bias that itself was formed out of visceral, emotional imagery. I'll take opening now.
Okay, Michael, if all of the ads are showing the same pictures of starving children, how do you differentiate between which ones are going to give to infrastructure and which ones are actually dealing with the children?
Well, Daniel, it's quite simple, right? Sorry, apologies. It's quite simple, right? You see the ad, you think, goodness, these people are suffering, and then you sit down, you get to your bank account, you think, which charity should I give to? Which one will actually have the biggest impact? And I simply don't believe that people are as impulsive and reckless as you would think in terms of the fact they don't make that computation. Hint, they're making every other decision they make in their lives. The second thing to say is that the representation of poor countries in public life, and this segues onto what opening and closing government said, right, is especially poor. We're not often made aware of their suffering. The media and politicians often like to focus on the suffering of people at home, and it's natural that they should do so, given that those are the audiences they're catering to. As a politician, that's where the votes are, and as the media, that's where your consumers are. So it makes sense to focus on issues that are proximate to them. The key problem is this. People have limited space in their minds to think about those who are far away and to not think about their own lives. When most of the information they receive about people who are not them and about the world around them is about people in their own country, those are the people they're much more likely to care about. Those are the people who are likely to occupy that mental space. The only way we can pierce through that tidal wave of information is to say, look, here is someone you should definitely care about, and reach out to their basic moral sentiment towards these people that's been obscured by the fact they don't hear about them very much. Charities are never going to be able to provide as many point-by-point analyses for why we should help people as politicians are when it comes to helping domestic people. The only way you can break through this is to do emotions. The third thing is that people self-select away from this information, right? Look, if I want to, generally, Daniel is correct to point out that these ads make people feel quite bad about themselves. So typically, I'm going to want to turn away from the suffering of people in the developing world. Typically, when it comes on the news, I'm going to want to turn it off. Typically, that's not information that I'm going to want to care about rationally, because it does make me feel bad about the world in which I live. However, when I put an advertisement out there saying, look, these people are suffering, on literally every show, whether it's the news, whether it's The Simpsons, without much informational content, but that just reaches out to my emotional sentiment, it doesn't require much attention from me, that happens so quickly and reaches out to me so quickly that I don't have time to turn the button off, that is much more likely to impact my decision. And crucially, it's something I'm discounting my decision anyway because of my subconscious bias away from things that say that the world is a nasty and unfortunate place. Look, at the end of this debate, we are the first team to tell you the actual informational and emotional landscape in which these people find themselves and why this is necessary to pierce into that. I'm very, very proud to oppose. Apologies for swearing, by the way. I'm very, very sorry.
The last person to care. I mean, unless the offended someone, in which case. What's all this? Sorry?
going to talk about friendship for 7 minutes, that's the mood I'm in. Okay, I'm going to talk about actually two things. I'm going to talk about efficacy, because that is essentially what this debate has come about. Is this better for charity? Is this better for people who are suffering? We say, absolutely. Is it better for donors? Maybe also not important, but if it is, then great. Number two, on monopolising perceptions. That is the perception of the people at home, and also the perception of Africa as a country which really doesn't get any response. First of all, one massive extraneous point of rebuttal, which is essentially that what Second Op give you is possibly a better explanation of why it is that people respond emotionally to things. Note that what we actually said was that regardless of whether people do respond more emotionally to something, that's actually damaging, in that what we say is you can never make people emotionally connect with whether or not we should have better roads in South Sudan, right? And those are the things that would actually affect change on a large scale, rather than giving patchwork aid here and there wherever a problem crops up. That never actually creates real change. Therefore, regardless of the efficacy of visceral ads, we say that it harms other kinds of advertising in a really damaging way. Okay, how effective is this, right? Okay, essentially the contention we get from this debate is that not only do visceral ads work, which they probably do, they work the absolute best rather than any other ad. The problem is, right, we say the reason that stuff like a celebrity clapping every 3 minutes works is because it is in itself novel. The problem is emaciated children is not novel. You cannot make emaciated children any more novel than they were 30 years ago when we started advertising on TV. Therefore, the problem is you do get the desensitization problem that they essentially say does not exist, because sure, it still works. Okay, we say there has been a massive drop in the amount of advertising revenue or money that we have received, no thank you, from these kind of ads over the last 20-year arc, right? Seeing as it is no longer something that is novel. Therefore, we really challenge whether this is the most efficacious way of doing this. Regardless, though, we say that when you ban the really visceral ads, and when you actually force charities to shift the locus of what they see as their responsibility to institutional changes, to structural changes, we say that is far more effective. First off, tell us, number one, we can still support structural changes. We absolutely can't, at the point at which they are crowded out by the fact that there's a child starving somewhere. If I'm a charity, no thank you, and I have to choose between airing an ad about an emaciated child, which I know works to some degree, and whether or not we should build roads in Rwanda, I am more than likely going to choose one that I think will raise more revenue, because that's the model we currently have. We don't know whether it's actually true that would be the case, for a reason I'm going to talk about later. We say that when I am faced with that visceral decision, maybe it is the case that no thank you, on a declining scale, that I'm likely to give money. However, we say that no thank you. No thank you. I just said no, right? We say that you are more than likely neglecting other aspects of charity that are incredibly important, would possibly be better for those people. We say the nature of desensitization is probably to desensitize. Second Op say people possibly self-select in that they remove themselves from those ads, they no longer watch them. But the point is, apparently some people give money. We say the fact that some people give money is probably more indicative of the fact that some people are naturally empathic. Some people, no thank you, are naturally charitable. That means that we think that there is still a good base for those people who want to do good to still give money, when the ads are not based on a child dying, rather on roads needing to be built somewhere, or us needing better educational structures, right? It is not the case that people will suddenly stop giving money. If you are inclined to give money, you are most likely going to do it anyway. Second Op say no thank you. Second Op say Second Op say something, and this is my response, okay? It is not the case that those two things can coexist, and it is not the case that we can run both of these kinds of ads. We can run one's about structural reform, one's about no thank you, one's about emotive responses, because they will never coexist, because I always, as a charity, have to prioritise something that I believe will bring me in more money. Once you remove that as a choice for them, they have to no thank you, they have to focus on something else, something we say that is better, leads to better long-term change, as Helen told you in her speech, right? No thank you. If it is the case that charities have to go where there's, as Second Op tell you, which is that you can now exploit the scale of the tragedy, whether or not people, less people are still dying, but now more people are dying, therefore people will still give money. See the fact, no thank you, that we still have a problem with that, in that no matter if I'm going into Haiti for 2 months to fix up an earthquake, if I leave because it's no longer, as Helen says, amusingly sexy, right? You don't get long-term change in that place, because then it switches to Rwanda, and then it switches to South Sudan, no thank you, and all you ever get is the rhetoric that charity doesn't work because we never see any long-term impacts of it. That's really damaging, okay? We say that it is better to have focused money on things that will actually have effects, and that's what we force charities to do. We
force them, no thank you, to exploit institutional changes and structural changes. I'll take a PY, go ahead.
Can you engage with our effectiveness
sure I
and material that charities will still stay on the same cause, but it will cost more in terms of fundraising, which means that they'll have less time and money to actually focus on programs?
We really don't think so. Like, I think really what makes me donate to a charity is not necessarily that I see the starving, emaciated child, but that I am confronted with the fact in my head that there is a starving, emaciated child somewhere. So if it is the case that charities can still say, by the way, people are dying and we can affect this real change, at the point at which the comparative is no longer, are there people dying in this ad and do they need roads in this ad, when the comparative is simply, do people need roads in this place or do they need hospitals in this place, you remove that emotional element from it. It's still as effective because people who will give money will probably still give money. People who don't give money to charity on the basis of emaciated child probably won't give money on the basis of hospital. No thank you, that's a wash, right? Perception and monopolizing, okay? Like, every day I see an ad on the TV that tells me that someone new is dying somewhere else that is far away, that I have no idea like how their life is and that kind of thing. So they talk about approximate bias and that kind of thing. Like, we say, like, whether or not it is emotionally manipulative, which it possibly is, our focus in this debate shouldn't necessarily be on whether or not we're exploiting like white people in the first world. Like, even if it is, we say we win on that on the basis for really compelling reasons first Brock give you. But moreover, we say that charities specifically have a duty to people that they are trying to help to not create an image of them that is really, really damaging to them in the long term. Like Helen talks about FDI, right? That is actually a point in this debate. At the point at which all I believe that there is in Africa is starving people by the roadside, I'm far less likely to, number one, believe that they are capable of the kind of abstract thought that I know that I am because I'm white and I'm from like Western Europe, right? But number two, I'm less likely to believe that my charity has any effect because there are people dying more and more every day because again, we only ever have band-aid solutions. But number three, like, you actually damage those people in that they don't get that kind of investment, they don't get that kind of infrastructure that they need to make a kind of self-fulfilling society that would actually help change lives in the long run. Like, they say that it is that we have to decide between like saving people like who are dying at the moment or like building roads. We absolutely don't. We can have both of those things, but at the point at which all we have is ads about starving people, we can't have both. So on our side we do, on their side they never do. We're delighted to propose.
Thank you very much. And the final word is Thomas.
Note that the disaster charities they condemn can still get money, because you can say things like, there has been an earthquake and we should rationally be responding to this. That's because people understand that an earthquake is a really bad thing and can probably relate to imagining that experience. What they can't relate to is the more abstract concerns, things like the types of institutions that they want to build up. When you use that image and link it in an abstract way, as the UN Development Programme does, you're able to get the money to make the long-term sorts of charitable outcomes that they want. Two areas in this debate. First, how do we maximise the value of aid? Secondly, how do we maximise the effectiveness of that aid? To this first issue on maximising the value of aid. So we've heard a lot in this debate about how people will just become desensitised to these images and as a result will no longer be effective at convincing people. We didn't have to support that we would only use these images, we just had to say that in some cases they might be effective and be willing to support that. If we can show that there are cases where this boosts the overall value of aid, then that helps our side. But further to the point, just because you have a finite amount of caring when you're shown these images doesn't mean you should. I mean, there are only 7 Harry Potter books. That was a limited amount. It was still worth making them into movies. That's just because people might have a limited amount of caring from these images, it still makes sense to leverage that as best you can to maximise the foreign aid value. And that's something we're able to do. If they stop being effective, then use all of their rational ads, as we're sure charities can do, because we trust that they're run by reasonably smart people who get marketing, judging by the fact they are using highly effective ads at the moment. So Michael explained very clearly why it was there is a clear gap between domestic concerns and international concerns. So politicians, because they spend 95% of a country's money domestically, have an interest in fighting over the allocation of that 95% of money. That means the vast majority of reporting on issues and the vast majority of political discussion is focused upon concerns which don't have the greatest utilitarian benefit in terms of money, but focus on what is good domestically, because those are the people who are closest to you and those are the people that are already in the news. People are already able to relate to the homeless in their own country or the poor in their own country. They already have the emotional response that you guys condemn. What they don't have is the emotional response for people overseas, and that's something we're able to counter by providing an alternative. We're able to close that gap because we provide the same sorts of emotional attacks on people's ability to spend that is done domestically as is done internationally. If you simply cancel out the one of them while leaving the other to exist, then that's far more likely to lead to a misallocation of our resources. The fact that these ads make us incredibly uncomfortable is why they're so effective. It's important that we continue to leverage this in order to maximise the amount of money we have, because although opening government denied it, the amount of money is important. And when charities would be able to have their rational analysis of how exactly their aid dollar is going to be effective at the margins, then it probably implies that aid money is effective at the margins. So if they're going to get any of that charity aid altogether, then they have to accept that having more money in these organisations is a good thing. It's also important to note that having these images out there means you're more likely to get people voting for parties that support more development aid. So it's notable that the amount of aid spent by governments is greater than the amount spent by private sector organisations and charities. What this means is that when people have a general idea that suffering in Africa is incredibly great and have been exposed to that idea, they're more likely to vote in general for pro-development aid policies. So that leads to an even greater pool of aid, even if there's some crowding out effect or desensitisation thereof. Now let's turn to how this affects the effectiveness of this aid, but before I do that, I'll take opening.
If people are not so impulsive to donate poorly like Michael claims in response to us, why would they be so easily swayed by nationalism and identity?
So it's effective in convincing people that there is a problem. It's not necessarily effective in convincing people that this particular charity is the only way in order to get those development goals. The fact that people are generally aware that there are problems in other countries is the most important effect that we get on our side. But to the extent that you guys are wanting to point to charities spending their money ineffectively, something we think is empirically false, given that the vast majority of charity workers take cuts in their pay relative to what they get in the private sector and genuinely care about the people they're trying to help, there's further effects in terms of just getting that money out there in the first place. We think that's very important. We think it was bizarre that they wanted to state that there was no role for emotional considerations in making these decisions, because we think that is something important. The fact that someone is dying now is something that is an imperative that we stop, and if we can get that aid to that place, that is something that we think is important. They told us that that FDI is going to be misdirected because the investment banker at Goldman Sachs is going to sit there analysing his spreadsheet and go, oh, well, the data says investment in Africa would be really good and would produce massive benefits for the people there. But I saw a World Vision ad the other day that said they were just people sitting there with flies buzzing around their faces. That's not how bankers think. They're driven by a profit motive to seek out opportunities that other people aren't seeking out. Look, foreign direct investment isn't a guy chucking £2 when someone comes with a charity bin to your door. It's people making decisions based on data, something we think is important. It's also important to note that many of the organisations that do use this type of imagery are highly data driven. The primary example being the UN Development Programme, who do use these images to support a general idea that this development is important and do use the emotional heart-pulling, but then use the data they have behind the scenes in order to direct that in the most effective way. Furthermore, it's notable that charities often cross-subsidise with their charitable endeavours. So charities don't simply swan around to the latest disaster zone and ditch all of their effects to help people in countries which are no longer as immediately marketable. What they do is they use the immediate tragedy to get money into their charity, which is able to be used to cross-subsidise their other charitable endeavours which are important. Furthermore, it was just wrong of them to create a false dichotomy between the short-run and long-term and development effects. If an earthquake wipes out your infrastructure, it often is important that development aid is directed to that place in the short term, because the long-term prosperity of that economy is dependent on being able to get in there and stop the institutional collapse that frequently occurs after natural disasters. That's why we believe that there's often some emotional need for this money to be redirected to that place. Even if that's not the case, cross-subsidisation works and we get more aid money, we convince governments to spend aid money more effectively. Very proud to oppose.